Good evening to you all. My name is Edward Ramsamy, and I'm a faculty member and chair of the Africana Studies Department. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's program, Justice in Action, featuring Professor Lennox Hines and Professor Angela Davis. The idea for this program and Professor Angela Davis's visit to Rutgers this evening came about from a conversation between Dick Rick-Schrader, who's in the audience, and Professor Michael Welsh from the Criminal Justice Program on how best to commemorate and celebrate Professor Lennox Hines's retirement after 46 years of dedicated service to Rutgers University. Professor Hines started teaching at Rutgers in 1972. And we also wanted to reflect on the impact of Professor Hines' teaching and scholarship and activism on the global stage. Since Professor Hines, through the Conference on Black Lawyers, worked on Professor Angela Davis's defense during her trial and was a founding member of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Oppression, the organization that grew out of the struggle to free Professor Davis from the frame-up on murder charges, we thought it would be fitting that Professor Davis be the keynote speaker to celebrate and reflect on the life and work of Professor Hines. This afternoon, we had a series of panel discussions at the Paul Robeson Cultural Center, where former students of Professor Hines, who now have distinguished careers, and many of them are in the audience today, in the legal profession, reflected on the impact of their former professor on their lives and careers. And now, we are gathered here in this room to continue that celebration and reflection. The African proverb, "It takes a village," certainly applies to the collective effort it took to bring this program to fruition. Professor Welsh and I want to acknowledge the support of the School of Arts and Sciences, and in particular, again, Dean Rick Schrader, for his support of this program. Ms. Cara Donaldson, Dr. Cara Donaldson, from the Associate Dean for Planning and Communications within the School of Arts and Sciences, and her office were tremendous assistance in developing especially the publicity for this program that's essential for this magnificent turnout tonight. And we also want to acknowledge the support of Professor Pat Carr, the chair of the department or the program in criminal justice. The assistance of the staff of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center were invaluable. David Jones, the new director of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center, who just took the position in August, was brought into planning this program before he could find a parking lot at Rutgers in August. And together with Ms. Kiana Stewart, the assistant director of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center, provided invaluable assistance with the logistics of putting this program together. Dr. James Whitney, I don't know if he's in the audience. Dr. James Whitney, a former student of yours, Professor Hines, in the Criminal Justice Program, and now Assistant Vice Chancellor for Undergraduate Academic Affairs, together with Ms. Jacora Holman from Dr. Whitney's office, were also partners in this initiative. The reception that we're going to have after this event was sponsored by the Office of Student Access and Educational Equity, and also Professor Carol Fine, who teaches at Berkeley College in New York, but was a student of Professor Hines in 1983, and who had a lifelong impact on her life and her career. If I may venture with caution and some trepidation, given the presence of many distinguished lawyers in this room, the law serves many purposes in society, but among its key functions is to protect various liberties and rights that we individually are constitutionally entitled to. However, the law frequently has fallen short of this ideal, especially as it relates to people of color and particularly people of African ancestry in American society. In fact, There are many instances in which the law was used to deny people's rights and liberties. I am sure all of you in this room are familiar with the infamous Dred Scott decision, where blacks were declared non-citizens, the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that entrenched American apartheid, and the doctrine of separate but equal, the Buck versus Bell decision, written by the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes, that allowed forced sterilization of women. As one reflects on the implications of these decisions, one cannot help but resonate with the words of Charles Dickens in his novel Oliver Twist: "If that is the law, then the law is an ass." If you want to get an historical overview of instances in which the law was indeed an ass, I encourage you to read Professor Heinz's book that never ages, Illusions of Justice. In this afternoon's panel discussions, many of Professor Heinz's students commented that how he challenged his students to practice law and struggle for justice at the same time. Martin Luther King once commented, "An individual who breaks the law that conscience tells him is unjust and is willingly accepts the penalty of imprisonment in order to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice, is in reality expressing the highest respect for the law." Both Lennox Heinz and Professor Angela Davis belong to the tradition of not accepting the legal status quo, but fighting for justice. I have already spoken for far too long, and if I were to outline Professor Heinz's many achievements, we won't have time for the rest of the program. There is a display board at the entrance to this hall that highlights some of the distinguished world leaders that Professor Heinz has interacted with in his career. I invite you, if you haven't already, to take a look at it during the reception. Professor Heinz earned his bachelor's degree from City College in New York in 1962, not in the law, but in the sciences. He was awarded a United States patent for X-ray spectrochemical analysis in 1969, whatever that means to a non-scientist. We can ask him to explain. He then completed a law degree from Rutgers Law School and started a distinguished academic and legal career as a criminal defense and human rights lawyer that had a major impact both in the United States and globally. In the tradition of Paul Robeson, Rutgers' most distinguished alumnus, Professor Heinz has linked domestic struggles in the United States with international struggles. In addition to the many cases that he fought, he served as a lawyer for Frelimo, the movement fighting Portuguese colonial rule in Mozambique, SWAPO, the National Liberation Movement in Namibia, and was the lawyer for Nelson Mandela and the African National Congress in the United States. Need I remind you that Nelson Mandela, who's now celebrated as a statesman, was once regarded as a terrorist in the United States. Professor Heinz, together with Professor Angela Davis, were part of the global anti-apartheid movement that fought for Mandela's release and freedom. There are some moving pictures of Professor Heinz together with anti-colonial leaders, including Nelson Mandela, in the hallway. So without further ado, please give a warm welcome to Professor Lennox Heinz.
Please, thank you. Thank you. Be seated. Thank you, Professor Ramsamy, for those kind words of introduction. Colleagues, friends, brothers and sisters, permit me at the onset to thank Dean Schroeder and Professor Patrick Carr for initiating this event. I would be amiss not to acknowledge the tremendous work and effort of my colleague, Professor Michael Welsh, and Professor Carol Fine for coordinating and planning the program. I would also like to thank Professor Ramsamy, David Jones, and the staff of the Paul Robeson Cultural Center for their invaluable assistance in facilitating the seminars earlier today. I'd also like to express my appreciation to my former students who served as panelists during the various seminars that were held earlier today. It is not very often that a teacher lives long enough to hear former students talk about the impact that the teacher had on their lives. I was moved almost to tears to hear students whom I thought that I terrorized in the classroom tell me that through the pain and suffering that they endured, that it impacted on them in a positive way. And so I'd like to thank those students who, in fact, participate. Finally, I would like to express thanks to my friend and comrade, Professor Angela Davis, for agreeing to be here, notwithstanding her very busy schedule. Thank you, Angela. As I look across this room, I see many individuals with whom I have worked and struggled over the past 50 years. There's Vicki Ernstine, Yatoivo. Could you stand, Vicki? Who is the special advisor to the Minister of Labor in Namibia. And you will see a picture of me and her husband, Andimba Toivo Yatoivo, who is one of the founders of SWAPO and spent over 15 years at Robben Island with Nelson Mandela. Vicki Ernstine. There's Ron and Kate Copeland, who I've known for over 50 years. These are individuals with whom I developed a political relationship. They were part of a unit called the Collective. Ron and Kate. William Joseph, my comrade in arms, a brother who, right now, he is a lawyer, heads up one of the largest legal services programs in the country, but who is someone whom, if I have to take a last stand, I want him at my back, William Joseph. There's Jeannie Myra, Jeannie, who is the president of the International Association of Democratic Lawyers, one of the largest progressive lawyers organizations in the world, with over 100 members, 100 represented in over 100 member states around the world. Jeannie Myra. Finally, I have my colleagues and friends of the National Conference of Black Lawyers, an organization that I spent and continues to spend years with, and we have represented many individuals and causes that I will speak about later on. But allow me to specifically and specially introduce to you some members of my immediate family. My wife, Bessie, would you stand? My son, Brent, and his wife, Dorothy. My granddaughter, Simone, and her better half, Brian. My niece, Pat, and her husband, Adisa. I have mixed feelings standing here before you tonight, reflecting on a journey that has taken me from a career in pharmaceutical research at Charles Pfizer to petrochemical research at City Service Oil Company, to Rutgers Law School in Newark, to the National Conference of Black Lawyers, and finally, the faculty of Rutgers University. When I enrolled in law school in Newark, after a career as a research chemist, the semester that I enrolled in law school, my son Brent was enrolling as a freshman at Cornell University. So we both were going to school at the same time. It was a time when almost all of my fellow students at Rutgers saw the law as a sword and a shield for justice. For many of us, it was a prophetic mission that has shaped our professional careers and personal lives to this day. I never was interested in the private practice of law, per se. I went to law school to represent the people's movement as a people's lawyer. And I've continued to do that throughout my career. After graduating from law school, I served as the national director of the National Conference of Black Lawyers for 5 years. During that time, we represented politically unpopular clients at the time. I say at the time, such as Professor Angela Davis, who was unpopular then. Assata Shakur, Joanne Little, the Attica Brothers, the New York Eight, the Panther 21, Imari Obadali and the Republic of New Africa, and international clients such as the ANC, Nelson Mandela, and SWAPO, among others. As Professor Ramsamy said to you, I remind you that before Nelson Mandela was released from prison in South Africa, he was viewed by the United States government as the head of a terrorist organization, that is the African National Congress. As some of you are aware, the CIA, that is the Central Intelligence Agency, assisted the South African intelligence agencies in capturing Nelson Mandela in 1962. I was a legal counsel to Mr. Mandela and his delegation during his first United States tour in 1990 as he got out of prison. And he spent, as you know, 27 years there. At that time, my involvement as Mandela's lawyer during the tour and the delegation, I was to work with Mr. Mandela and the delegation. And I spent 1 week in the company of Mr. Mandela, assisting the delegation with legal advice, also assisting his speechwriters with tailoring his remarks to special constituencies in the United States. I remember in Detroit, I had to quickly tell the speechwriters, because I saw Aretha Franklin in the audience, and I said, Mr. Mandela must mention Aretha Franklin. He could not get up on the stage in Detroit and not mention him. But as we visited cities across the United States, I was also able to use my position as counsel to arrange one-on-one consultations with Mr. Mandela and particular individuals in the United States who were important in the movement and who I thought should meet with him, including Angela Davis and some other of my colleagues. Nelson Mandela was one of the most disciplined and magnanimous men that I've had the opportunity to know. He told me that while he was in prison, he and other leaders of the ANC will get up at 5 a.m. in the morning and hold political education classes before they went out to work in the mines. And he continued that discipline, and I saw it as I was a member of that delegation. Some of you who know me know that I am a gym rat. And I would get up 6 o'clock in the morning and be jogging. And by the time I was up during the trip in various cities across the United States, by the time I was up and going for a jog, I would see Nelson Mandela and his security detail coming in after his walk every morning. And he was up at 5 o'clock doing that. At the end of the tour, while myself and Harry Belafonte and other staff were gathered on the tarmac in San Francisco, he turned to me and said, "Lennox, do you have a pen and paper?" And I said, "Yes, Mr. Mandela." I got him a pen and paper. And he said, "I want to jot a personal note of thanks to President Bush." And I was struck by this. I felt compelled to say, "Mr. Mandela, you realize that President Bush at some point headed up the CIA that in fact caused you to be in prison for 27 years. And he said, "Lennox, that was then. Now it's a different time. And I feel that it is proper for me in this period of history to thank the President of the United States for the security that was provided." As most of you know, I taught courses here at Rutgers in the criminal law and international humanitarian law. 2 weeks ago, I was looking at television and saw our President, Obama, addressing the United Nations. And I could not but reflect on the dismal United States voting record at the United Nations. The United States as a country took credit for the liberation of the victims of the concentration camps in Auschwitz and Dachau. Then why would you think the United States Senate refused to ratify the Genocide Convention after it was enacted in 1948? You would think we would be one of the first countries to ratify the Genocide Convention. Those of you who are scholars, researchers, should review the congressional record at that time, which reveals that the Southern senators voted against ratification because they were fearful that African Americans would sue the United States under provisions of the convention for genocide committed against African Americans in the United States. Interestingly, Paul Robeson and William Patterson, the father of Dr. Mary Lou Patterson, who is here today, filed a petition at the United Nations in 1951, charging the United States with genocide in their policies and practices and treatment of African Americans. It took the United States 40 years, 40 years, to ratify the Genocide Convention. It also took the United States 29 years before ratifying the Convention on the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination. It took the United States 27 years to ratify the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. My friends, let me briefly share with you my observation and thoughts about the criminal justice system from the perspective of a practitioner in that system. If one examines the effects and results of the criminal justice system within the United States, it becomes clear that blacks, Puerto Ricans, Native Americans, Mexican Americans, and other minorities are victims of deliberate governmental policies and practices that deny them their basic human rights and abridge fundamental freedoms solely on the basis of race, solely on the basis of color, solely on the basis of descent, national or ethnic origin. These racist practices and policies are sharply manifest by what we see being played out on our television screens almost on a daily basis throughout the United States, in what I call police crimes. My friends, police crimes are the most egregious human rights violations being committed against people of color in the United States today. The irony is that the phenomenon is not new. It is persistent, endemic, and chronic. The only difference today is a cell phone, the iPhone, videos. In 1980, I presented a report on police crimes in the United States, a conference on crime prevention in Venezuela, to the United Nations. That report could have been written last week. American society functions normally through an elaborate system of laws. Poverty, racism, injustice, and oppression of people at home and abroad are not acts falling outside of the law. The law is inextricably entwined with its operation. Indeed, those acts result from the system of law. Politicians proclaim loudly and proudly that we are a country that operates under the rule of law. But I contend that the law in the United States has never been a friend of black people. It was the law which transformed black people into capital goods through the system of chattel slavery. It was the law that denied them humanity. And it was the law that divested Native Americans from their land, their culture, and their future. Every 4th of July, we hear school children recite the preamble to the United States Constitution without knowing or understanding the context. When the founding fathers of this country, all slaveholders, George Washington, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and the others announced to the world in loud terms, they said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these rights are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." These words were loudly proclaimed to the world while these hypocrites were standing on land stolen from a Native American people. They were looking into the faces of 700,000 African slaves, 20% of the nation that they declared to be free. The very constitution of this newfound nation of equally created men rejected the humanity of people who looked like me, solely on the basis of color. Now, why am I talking to you about the short review of the history of racism in the law in the United States? Why is it relevant? I contend that while the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution ostensibly abolished slavery, we are still facing the badges and indicia of slavery, which is reflected in a chronic and persistent racism in the criminal justice system. Hundreds of blacks and other minorities are killed by the police every year, and their killers know that they can continue to kill, they could continue to maim and cripple minorities without any expectation of judicial reprimand or punishment. Why? Because they operate behind the shield of racism. The fundamental remedy, my friends, to address police crimes in the United States is accountability. The police must be accountable to the communities they serve. But herein lies the contradiction. What is the role of the police in our system? What communities do they actually serve? We are told that their mission is to protect and serve. Protect and serve whom? The economic system in the United States, that is, for those of you who are educators and scholars, our economic system is called monopoly capitalism, which relegates minorities to the bottom of the barrel. And the role of the police is to keep them there. So when you hear politicians talk about law and order, they are talking about keeping the system intact, and those who are at the bottom of the barrel trying to get out of it to keep them in their place. Hence the term, which is trumpeted by politicians now, of law and order, during this election campaign. Increased unemployment brings with it increased community struggles, confronting the inequities of the existing economic order. Consequently, increased community struggles are met with increased repression by the police. Today, the police and law enforcement's primary function is to protect the economic interests of corporate America and to maintain the existing economic order. Therefore, the police are ultimately accountable to the corporate interests in the United States. Only when those economic interests are jeopardized by the lawlessness of the police would corporate America take the necessary steps to make the police accountable to the communities in which they work. Therefore, I continue to contend that the communities which are affected by the lawlessness of the police must force corporate America to choose between maintaining the existing structure of police lawlessness and face economic losses, or make the police accountable to the communities in which they work. To achieve the community accountability, these communities should develop a multifaceted strategy, which includes utilizing both the criminal law and civil law, including suing the police, that is individual officers, police departments, municipalities, for money damages. I note that the National Conference of Black Lawyers has embarked on a program to train a cadre of lawyers around the United States with the specific skills in suing police officers, police departments, and municipalities for money damages arising from charges of police crimes. That project, being run by the National Conference of Black Lawyers, is called the Law Enforcement Accountability Project, or LEAP. My colleagues, Annette Ensley and William Joseph, have been responsible for initiating that project. Annette Ensley, Stan, and William Joseph. But, my friends, communities must be cognizant on the limitations of the law and understand that power ultimately lies in the people. Therefore, I encourage people to utilize their First Amendment rights and take to the streets to seek redress of their grievances. Now, I know that after I speak tonight, there will be another page in my FBI file. It will be Heinz spoke at Rutgers University, and then there will be a redaction of who was in this audience, who in fact is working for the FBI. I have no illusions of this, and those of us who have been in the movement long enough know that informers come in all different stripes and all different colors. I believe that the communities have to utilize selective boycotts, targeting certain corporate interests within their communities, and thereby forcing corporate America to choose between supporting the lawlessness of the police or risking their economic interests. We need to think very carefully of the contradictions that exist and utilize those contradictions in the interests of our constituencies. I thank Rutgers University for providing me with the opportunity to teach thousands of gifted and dedicated students during the 46 years that I've taught here. I thank my colleagues on the faculty for your encouragement of supporting me over the years, although I know that supporting me has been, at times, a trying endeavor. For example, I traveled to Iran in 1979 when Americans were being held hostage, in opposition to then President Jimmy, the Peanut Carter, who banned Americans from traveling. But I know that no president could deny Americans from traveling any place. The only denial is that you cannot use your US passport to travel. So I went off to Iran. And the local press had a field day. There were some people were calling for firing Lennox Hines. How could someone at a public university, a professor, defy the President of the United States? And they're over there in Iran. Ed Blaustein, who was the president, and I was never really a fan of Ed, but to his credit, he came to my defense. He said, Lennox Hines is a tenured professor. I'm told he's a very popular professor. He's doing his work here at Rutgers. He's broken no law, and I'm not going to take any action against him. Friends, it has been a wonderful journey. Thanks for the memories. And I'll be sharing those memories with you in my memoirs, and excuse the pun, called Hindsight. Thank you. I walked off, not realizing I had another task. Angela, you could sit. I'm going to take a few minutes. I've been asked to introduce someone who needs no introduction. But I'm taking the liberty because it's not often that I have the opportunity to introduce my colleague, friend, and comrade, Angela Davis, who I've known now for over 43 years. Through her activism and scholarship over many decades, Angela Davis has been deeply involved in movements for social justice around the world. Her work as an educator, both at the university level and the larger public sphere, has always emphasized the importance of building communities of struggle for economic, racial, and gender justice. Professor Davis has taught at a number of schools on the East Coast and West Coast, and spent 15 years at Santa Cruz, where she retired as a distinguished professor emerita of history of consciousness, an interdisciplinary PhD program. Professor Davis is the author of 10 books and has lectured throughout the United States, as well as in Europe, Africa, Asia, Australia, and South America. She is a founding member of Critical Resistance, a national organization dedicated to the dismantling of the prison industrial complex. Internationally, she is affiliated with Sisters Inside, an abolitionist organization based in Queensland, Australia, that works in solidarity with women in prison. Like many educators, Professor Davis is especially concerned with the general tendency to devote more resources and attention to the prison system than to educational institutions. Having helped to popularize the notion of prisons industrial complex, she now urges her audiences to think seriously about the future possibility of a world without prisons, the 21st century abolitionist movement. She is an abolitionist. I want you to join your hands together and welcome Angela Davis.
Thank you, Lennox. I'm very much looking forward to hindsight. Good evening, everyone. It is really an honor to be able to join Lennox and all of his friends and colleagues who are celebrating his retirement. I cannot believe that you are about to retire, Lennox. I have known him, how long? 40? You said 43 years. Actually, I think I knew you before I met you. So I would say almost 46 years. Almost a half of a century. And I can say that you here at Rutgers University can be proud that for most of his life he has graced you with his presence, with his intellectual acuity, and with his determination to reach for justice. In my notes, I was going to list some of the accomplishments that we associate with Lennox, but he's already spoken about the National Conference of Black Lawyers and the International Association of Democratic Lawyers. I don't think, did you mention the Alliance?
Yes. No, I don't think I did.
I don't think you did. So I'll mention the fact that he and I were co-founders of the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And Lennox has named almost everybody on the first and the second row. So I'm going to point to Ann Mitchell, who hasn't yet been named, but who was involved with us as we attempted to create this organization that would continue to struggle to free political prisoners. This was in the aftermath of my own acquittal. I said I made Lennox's acquaintance when I was in jail. And since there are quite a few young people in the audience, maybe, yeah, we'll have one. Maybe I'll try to give you a sense of what that era was like. I personally was charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, and I actually made the FBI's 10 most wanted lists. I was and you see, this is when you know that history does make a difference. When you can say that you were on the FBI's 10 most wanted list and you get applause. And prior to that, I had, worked in many campaigns to free political prisoners. Huey Newton, Bobby Seale, Erica Huggins, George Jackson, the Soledad Brothers, Los Siete de la Raza. And I was captured on October 13th, 1970. So almost exactly 46 years ago. And through my friend Margaret Burnham, who remains, I think, probably my very oldest friend, because our mothers were best friends and they were pregnant together. So I always say I've known her since before I was born. Through Margaret, who was active in the emergent National Conference of Black Lawyers, I met Haywood Burns, and I learned of Lennox Hines. I was sitting in jail in the Women's House of Detention in Greenwich Village in New York at the time, and obviously I was charged with 3 capital crimes, and I needed a lawyer. Or a few lawyers. And Margaret, who was my very best friend, was very young. As a matter of fact, when she came down to the House of Detention to see me, they refused to allow her to enter because they thought she was joking. She looked far too young to be an attorney. But through Margaret, I met Haywood Burns and Lennox Hines and the leadership of the newly formed National Conference of Black Lawyers. And I see that there are many representatives of NCBL and Ned and Wilhelm and Marlene. And then I remember Mary Lou Patterson, who I also have known since we were 6 years old or something like that. And right now I can hear her voice resonating from the demonstration that gathered on the night I was arrested. No, actually it was a little later, because by then I was actually in a cell and I could look down at the street. And I remember when you came, and you had this wonderful voice that resonated up to the 11th floor of the Women's House of Detention. But in any event, Lennox was one of the attorneys who represented me in New York in the effort to challenge the conditions of confinement. The fact that I was first placed in the psychiatric ward, and then I was moved to solitary confinement. But most importantly, and they were able to work that out so that I finally ended up in the main population, which was wonderful because at that time we could begin to do some organizing, which we did. And that's when you came, Mary Lou, I think, yeah. And most importantly, though, the question was who would be on the legal team? This was an important issue because there were clearly, at that point, very well-known attorneys who had represented political prisoners in celebrated cases. There was Charles Gary, an incredible attorney who handled many of the cases of the Black Panther Party. There was William Kunstler. They were perhaps the 2 most well-known attorneys who were representing political prisoners, and I had enormous respect for them. But I also thought that there had to be Black lawyers who would stand up for justice in that way. I knew that there were Black lawyers who were willing to associate themselves with radical causes. Lennox and Haywood and Margaret and others recommended a civil rights attorney from Atlanta, Georgia, by the name of Howard Moore. And so Howard moved to Berkeley, California to represent me, and Howard still lives in Berkeley, California. And I mean, I could also spend a great deal of time talking about the development of the the legal team, but I will mention Leo Branton, who recently passed away, who was also an absolutely amazing attorney, and Margaret Burnham and Doris Walker. But I want to focus now on what I came to most appreciate about Lennox, and that is the fact that he as he so brilliantly demonstrated with his remarks this evening, he knows how to simultaneously maneuver through the legal arena and the arena of mass struggle. And he has never failed to recognize that both are needed in order to achieve victories. When I think of revolutionary lawyers, I think of Lennox Hines. When I think of revolutionary organizers, I think of Charlene Mitchell. And our relationship over the last half century has been very much mediated by the work of Charlene Mitchell. And so, in the aftermath of my acquittal, we created this organization called the National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. I mean, it was interesting because during the time that I was in jail and on trial, I felt that far too much attention was being focused on me as an individual. You know, and although, of course, I was very helpful that there were all of these brilliant lawyers and organizers and movements were being created all over the country and all over the world, I looked at my sisters who were in jail with me, and I asked, well, who will speak for them? Who will speak for the vast numbers of people who are also victims of this repression? And so we actually changed the name of the organizational National United Committee to Free Angela Davis to National United Committee to Free Angela Davis and All Political Prisoners. And so after we partied on the night of the acquittal, and we did party, but the next day we sat down to try to figure out how to harness that energy and not to allow it to dissipate so that we would have to reinvent the circle every time a new political prisoner case emerged. And so this is how the National Alliance was formed. And it was our expression of what it meant to engage in the quest for justice. It was our expression of radical visions of justice at the time. And so we were persuaded that our unity, our organization, our collective determination, our creativity would allow us to free many more political prisoners and to defend the rights of prisoners in general, to build movements against racist and anti-Semitic violence, to challenge police crimes, and we share a vocabulary that recognizes the criminality of the very force that is designed to rid our societies of criminality, to help shift popular understandings about the interconnections between racist and political repression. And this is why we ended up with such an awkward name and organization, NAARPR, National Alliance Against Racist and Political Repression. And I don't know how many versions of that I have seen over the years. But we organized, we demonstrated, we protested, we provided legal representation, we developed alliances with elected officials and church activists and labor unions. And for many years, we proved that we could stand up to and sometimes even defeat dominant strategies of repression. We helped to free Lolita Lebron and the Puerto Rican nationalists. We helped to free Carlos Feliciano. We helped to free Frank Smith, or Big Black, and the Attica, and many of the other Attica brothers. We helped to free Joanne Little, and of course Lennox was a major figure in terms of the legal defense of many of these cases. Reverend Ben Chavis and the Wilmington 10. Some of us were at Wounded Knee during the occupation in 1973, and later we helped to build the movement to defend Leonard Peltier. We developed model legislation against the racist acts of the Ku Klux Klan, and in what we now know as hate crimes, we developed model legislation in which we called it racist violence, anti-Semitic violence. These are the forerunners of the hate crimes legislation. And I would be critical of that, but maybe during the question and answer period, someone can ask a question about that. But we convened hearings against police crimes, and with the help of Lennox Hines, presented petitions to the United Nations, and of course his amazing book, Illusions of Justice, as you heard earlier, is still very much relevant today. We sponsored investigations conducted by international jurors, and therefore we helped to create a political terrain on which police crimes and racial profiling could be taken seriously. We were convinced that we could effectively defend our radical visions of justice. But we are still working on some of the cases that we took on back then, over 4 decades ago. We are still working on the case of Leonard Peltier. And let me say that if Barack Obama is truly concerned about his legacy, he should grant clemency to Leonard Peltier. Especially at a time when we should be acknowledging the centrality of the struggles of the indigenous people of North America, particularly given the protests now that are being waged by the Standing Rock Sioux. Struggles against the pollution of our planet, the water sources which are being poisoned by the pipeline that will move through 4 different states. We're still struggling to free Assata Shakur. And I was reflecting on the several times I've had the opportunity to visit Rutgers. But the most memorable time was somewhere back in the late 1970s, I believe. And Lennox was a young professor here. I guess it was a few years after you joined the faculty. And And the alumni, at the Alumni House, there was an event organized designed to raise funds for the legal defense of Assata Shakur. Assata was still in the U.S. And so we all had a nice gathering in which we talked about the case and raised a lot of money. I remember I was shocked that so much. It was the Black Alumni House, wasn't it?
No, it was
Oh.
the Rutgers on College Avenue.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it was here in Rutgers. I got that right. But that's not the point. The point is, we were preparing after the event to have a more informal gathering at Lennox's and Bessie's home. And so we left, got in cars outside of the venue, and suddenly the New Brunswick police comes up to us and made me get out of the car. Lennox, who's in another automobile, sees what's happening and runs over because he's an attorney, of course, and he gets ready to show his bar card to the cop, who then points a shotgun at his head. This was like right here at the university. And eventually they let us go, and they said something about there was a warrant out for my arrest, and there was no warrant out for my arrest. But it was a very frightening moment because it allowed us to understand what very well might have happened to Assata Shakur here in New Jersey. But this wasn't the end. We got to the house and we were eating and so forth and realized that there were cops surrounding the house with guns. And so I remember we called John Conyers' office in Washington and asked him to please provide federal escort for us across the George Washington Bridge so we could be ushered safely to New York. Yeah, that was my most memorable visit to Rutgers. But let me continue. I'm trying to evoke some of the cases in which Lennox was centrally involved. There's another case of Mundo Wailanga, and you were his counsel, right? Armando, unfortunately, passed away this past February. He spent over 40 years in prison in Nebraska with his co-defendant, Edward Poindexter. You know, I was so sorry that he had to spend the overwhelming majority of his life behind bars. I evoked him during an earlier conversation with students who were asking about the issue of rehabilitation and how rehabilitation happens in prisons. And I was saying, you know, I don't think rehabilitation can truly happen inside these structures that are designed to constrict your freedom. How can one possibly learn how to engage as a free human being under circumstances that constrict every aspect of one's behavior? But I went on to say, I think many prisoners have helped to rehabilitate some of the people with whom they cohabit. that space, and particularly mentorship that develops between older prisoners and younger prisoners. And Mando was perhaps the best example of the person who shared so much and is responsible for so many people, young men in prison, deciding to not only make something of themselves and to build lives build individual lives, but to associate with movements that are struggling for freedom. And so I thought that that I would read one of Mando's poems, because he was an amazing poet too. And this one is called When It Gets to This Point, by Wopashitwe Mando Wailanga. Michael Brown, I never heard of him, had never heard anything he'd done before the news of his death came. Whoever he might have been, might have become, whatever he might have achieved had he lived longer, not been riddled lifeless by bullets from Darren Wilson's gun and crumpled on the pavement of a Ferguson street for more than 4 hours in the heat of that August day. And before, I had never heard of Trayvon Martin, had never known of who he was until I learned of his demise and cause of death, a bullet to the chest, George Zimmerman, the shooter, a badgeless pretend police with a pistol and a fear of the darkness. Trayvon's darkness. And after a while, the pictures, the names, the circumstances run together like so much colored laundry in the wash that bleeds on whites. Was it Eric Garner or Tamir Rice, who was 12, but seen as 20? Hulk Hogan or the Hulk with demonic eyes, it was said, who shrank the cop in Ferguson into a 5-year-old who had to shoot, just had to shoot. And John Crawford III in a Walmart store aisle, an air rifle in his hands he'd pick up from the shelf and held in an open carry state. Was it John or someone else killed supposedly by mistake in a dark stairwell? I know Akai Gurley fell. I hadn't heard of him before, nor Amadou Diallo, nor Sean Bell prior to their killings. Which of these took slugs in the greater number? I don't recall. My memory is too encumbered with the names of so many before and since. The frequent news reports of non-arrests, non-indictments, non-true bills, and duplicitous presentations by, quote, experts in the field, the consultants put out front to explain away that which is so often plain as day, to coax and convince us that we're the ones who can't see straight and can't hear clearly, who are the ones replacing facts with spin to mislead and mystify, as the beatings and the chokings and shootings of our boys and men by these wrong arms of the law proceed in orderly fashion before the sometimes sad, sometimes angry faces of our uncertain, our hesitant disbelief. Mando Wailanga. And I want to evoke the case of Mumia Abu-Jamal, who has been in prison far too long, 35 years. This coming December 9th will mark the 35th anniversary of the encounter on the streets of Philadelphia that led to the incarceration of Mumia Abu-Jamal and led to him being placed on death row for so many years. I just recently had the opportunity to spend about 3 hours with Mumia. And those of you who are familiar with this case will know that he's had a very difficult time. he's been diagnosed with hepatitis C, and the prison authorities will not allow him to take the medicine that is capable of curing hep C. It cost about $100,000 for 2 10-day dosage or whatever. I mean, you see these ads on TV, right? And so they're giving, what they're giving him now, I learned, is, have you heard of this pharmaceutical, Otezla? Okay, you see the ads on TV, right? And hep C causes a rash that might be similar to psoriasis. Otezla is, I suppose, designed to address psoriasis. That's what the TV commercials tell you, right? But I looked online to see what the contraindications were, and online it says that you have to be very careful if the person has hepatitis C. And this is the medicine that he is receiving. And Mumia is someone who never thinks about himself. He's become our most important advocate of the abolition of the death penalty. In the 3 hours that I spent with him not long ago, not once did he complain. Not once did he even talk about his own case. He was talking about everything else. And so I want to appeal to you in the spirit of the search for justice, the quest for justice, radical visions of justice, to join the effort to free Mumia and to end life imprisonment without parole. I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, that we become captive to these ideologies that define how we think about something like the death penalty, and how we automatically assume that the alternative is life without possibility of parole, right? But as Brian Stevenson and others have pointed out, that's a death sentence. That's a sentence to die in prison. And so now is the time, I believe, to develop a movement that points out that it makes no sense to replace one death sentence with another and assume that we're moving forward, assume that that's success. Now, there's so many other cases I could speak about. I just want to give you a sense of the work that has made me develop such respect for Lennox's approach. And this is, of course, the month during which we observe the 50th anniversary of the Black Panther Party. And I'm going back to Oakland to participate in an event on Saturday, I think, that is a part of a whole series of events in Oakland on the Black Panther Party. So I was thinking about all of those years, those 50 years between the emergence of the Black Panther Party and the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement. And many people try to get at what might be similarities, what are the connections, but it seems to me that the decades and the generations that separate one movement from another create a certain incommensurability that is a consequence of all of the changes that have happened, the economic changes, the political changes, the cultural changes, the technological changes that make this moment so different in many important respects from the late 1960s. But at the same time, as Lennox was pointing out, it sounds as if we haven't moved forward at all. As he was saying, we can read his book, Illusions of Justice, and think that we're reading about incidents and events that are unfolding right now. But I've thought about the connections between these two movements, and I think that the connections might be revealed not so much in similarities, but through the radical differences of the organizations. Because there's a tendency sometimes to say, well, we need another Black Panther Party. You know, we need a Black Panther Party for the 21st century. The Black Panther Party emerged as a response to the police occupation of Oakland, California, and Black urban communities across the country. It was an absolutely brilliant move on the part of Huey Newton and Bobby Seale to patrol the neighborhood with guns and law books. In other words, they set out to police the police. Now, at the time, the same strategy, which was admittedly also inspired by the emergence of guerrilla struggles in Cuba and liberation armies in Southern Africa and in the Middle East, and the successful resistance offered by the National Liberation Front in Vietnam. In retrospect, though, I think it reflected a failure to recognize, as Audre Lorde put it, that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. In other words, the use of guns, even though primarily as symbols of resistance, conveyed the message that the police could be challenged effectively by relying on policing strategies. Okay, let's jump forward 50 years. A hashtag developed by Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi in the aftermath of the vigilante killing of Trayvon Martin, Black Lives Matter. This hashtag began to develop into a network as a direct response to the rising protests in Ferguson in the summer of 2014, which manifested as a collective desire to demand justice for Mike Brown and for all of the Black lives sacrificed on the altar of racist police terror. In asking us to radically resist the racist violence at the heart of policing structures and strategies, Black Lives Matter early on recognized that we would have to place the demand to demilitarize the police at the center of our efforts to move toward a more radical vision of justice, a more critical and collective mode of justice. And demilitarization also contested the ways in which police strategies have been transnationalized through circuits that link small U.S. police departments to the State of Israel, which dominates the arena of militarized policing, given the experience they have with the occupation of Palestine. Now, I appreciate this more complicated analysis that is embraced by many BLM activists, because it reflects a kind of historical mindedness that is able to build upon and embrace and radically critique activisms and anti-racist theories of the past. It's able to embrace emergent feminisms. Well, let me say that actually the Black Panther Party 50 years ago did, to a certain extent, embrace feminism and what was then referred to as the gay liberation movement. Look at Huey Newton's articles in the Black Panther. It was an effort to get the membership of the Black Panther Party to embrace gay liberation. But the leaders and activists of the Black Lives Matter movement have seriously developed approaches that take up feminist and queer theories and practices in ways that allow us to imagine a very different approach to the question of eradicating racist police violence. And I'll just say, because I don't have very much more time, but to understand the relationship between state violence and intimate violence. To recognize that the violence that happens in our communities that we refer to, because we have been ideologically conditioned to refer to it as black-on-black violence, and the assumption that it is totally different from the violence that comes from the state, from the police, from the prisons, makes it impossible to imagine solutions that will ultimately purge our worlds of these interconnected modes of violence. And so I like, I like the more complicated, the more feminist analysis that is associated with the young activists. And young activists are supposed to be better than old activists. They're supposed to be standing on our shoulders. And if they stand on our shoulders, it means they take advantage of what we struggle to learn. As a matter of fact, they learn how to take that for granted and then to look further. And so they see much more than we're able to see. But unfortunately, most people who age forget that they were ever young. You know, it's really bizarre, this kind of amnesia that makes you assume that because you have the experiences, that your wisdom is so much greater, and even if your wisdom is greater, you may not be aware of new ways of thinking about what it means to be free. And if one imagines how slaves felt about freedom and what freedom meant then, and how that has become so much more complicated, that we cannot dismantle structures of racism without also dismantling structures of heteropatriarchy. And I think that as we look at the internationalism of organizations like our own National Alliance and the Black Panther Party, that international framework was so important. And you know, sometimes there are lessons that you learn from from the past. And I appreciate that the Black Lives Matter movement has internationalized their approach. And for example, a number of organizations, including Black Lives Matter, but Black Lives Matter is a movement, and it's also an organization. The movement is much larger. It includes Dream Defenders, it includes Black Youth Project 100, it includes a whole range of young organizations. And the delegation that was organized to Palestine about a year and a half or so ago made a major difference. Because of course, Palestinians were the first to respond to Ferguson activists. They were the first to offer support and solidarity because they noticed from the videos that they saw that the tear gas canisters that were on the ground in Ferguson, Missouri, were made by the same company as the tear gas canisters that were thrown at them in Palestine. And so they tweeted advice. And they, for example, they said that stay as close to the police as you can, which is counterintuitive, but the police aren't going to throw the tear gas where they are affected by the tear gas. So, I mean, it was really interesting, that relationship that developed. And I need to begin to conclude here. And I'm trying to think about how we might express the dual tendency that has been present in our entire history, that consists of assimilation on the one hand and more radical critique on the other. It has been with us forever. And at each juncture, we are confronted with with solutions that are either assimilationist or that might help us move in a more radical, progressive direction. And there is so much assimilation going on right now. As someone who has been involved in the effort to reveal the depth of the problem of what we came to call the prison industrial complex, and mass incarceration is not it's not just about mass incarceration, because we can get rid of mass incarceration and still have incarceration. You see, we can get rid of mass incarceration, and there can still be this strategy to make sure that the people who deserve to be in prison will go to prison. And so that's why we began to call ourselves abolitionists. That's the non-assimilationist approach, the abolition of policing. And I totally agree with you, accountability. But we also sometimes need to dream. We also need to remind ourselves what we ultimately want. And do we want a society that will always have to be policed? What would it mean to develop notions of security that do not rely so heavily on policing? Why can't security also mean education and health care and housing and jobs? And so I think that, sometimes even if we know that we will probably never experience a world in which there are no more police or no more prisons, we still have to remind ourselves that this is the direction in which we want to go. And if we think about the historical activism that enabled us to be here today, did those who struggled against slavery, those who struggled against settler colonialism and the genocide inflicted on Native people in this country, did they ever imagine centuries ago that we would be where we are today? They couldn't imagine it in terms of what it is we are actually experiencing. But I'm sure, somebody thought that freedom, somebody realized that freedom would be far vaster than they could ever imagine, given the constraints of the historical moment. And so I think we have to sometimes really say what we want ultimately, and not forget that, because if we stop saying it, we'll think that we just want better prisons. We'll think that, we just want the people who really deserve to be in prison. And we won't ask the question, well, does anyone really deserve to be locked up like that? Because if we answer that question with yes, it means that we aren't even committed to addressing the worst reasons why someone might go to prison. How can we purge our worlds of the harm that people inflict on each other, rather than assuming that those harms are always going to be with us, and therefore we'll need a place to put the people who do that? Let's think about, how to create a different kind of world. And as Lennox said, it's not going to be a capitalist world. We know that. And if we recognize how global capitalism has globalized all of these technologies of punishment, so that people in Africa, for example, their first encounter with new technologies is often when they go to prison, which is computerized and, all of that. So how can we also recognize the extent to which we are connected with people all over the world? The immigration issue here, the refugee crisis in Europe, and voting. We have to vote. So in order to achieve radical visions of justice, what does all of this have to do with the current election? I mean, I know I have to say something about that. And I know that those of you who are on social media may have seen some statement that I made that was totally out of context, that said that it's narcissistic to say that I cannot bring myself to vote for Hillary Clinton. Now, should I explain it? Yes. Because I do not support Hillary Clinton. I mean, I'm not, but I begin by saying that I think we should have learned by now that the arena of electoral politics militates against the expression of radical political perspectives. But this doesn't mean that we urge our communities not to vote, because we have devoted far too much energy and lost far too many lives in the struggle for voting rights not to go to the polls. I think Lennox will agree with me when I say that we need another political party. We need an independent party, a party that is inspired by the Black radical tradition in the largest sense, a party that is grounded in labor, a party that is a feminist party, a party that is led by and addresses the interests of Black people, Native Americans, Latinos, Asian Americans, Muslim Americans, working class people of all racial backgrounds, a party that is anti-capitalist, a party that supports immigrant rights, LGBTQI rights, environmental justice, for food sovereignty, a party that is against the brutality inflicted on animals in industrialized food production. Okay, so that's what I said. And I said, but we don't yet have this party. So what should be our primary concern during this current election? Our primary concern should be preserving possibilities for organizing such a party and building radical movements in the future. And so I said that I am going to the polls next month, and I know I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump, because a vote for him would precisely be to close future possibilities for the next generations. For example, by stacking the Supreme Court with conservative justice. And so what that means is that even if we don't want to, we may be compelled to vote for the other candidate. But we're not voting for that candidate as the best candidate, but rather in order to preserve the possibilities for future organizing. And we need movements that acknowledge the intersectionality of all of these issues, movements that are sufficiently open to allow for the future development of ideas and issues and movements, even those that we cannot even begin to imagine today. Thank you.
We want to thank Professor Davis and Professor Hines for those inspiring and challenging words. We have some time for questions, so if you have any questions, please, there are mics on either end. We'll just go back and forth. So just come to either mic and you can address it either to Professor Davis or Professor Hines or either one. So let's start. Yes.
Hello. This is a question for Professor Davis. You mentioned the Standing Rock Sioux's protest of the Dakota Access Pipeline. What are your concerns about the environment and the connection between environmental destruction and racism?
I think we should hear Mike.
Well, absolutely. We're talking about justice and radical visions of justice. And the notion of environmental justice has been with us for a long time, particularly because we're able to see the racialization of environmental devastation. What communities are the communities that suffer most from this pollution? Look, for example, at Flint, Michigan, and look at the fact that $100 a day could have prevented the pollution of the water supply in Flint. $100 a day. And the city government didn't want to spend that money. And so they allowed the water from the Flint River to pour through the pipes, thus corroding the old pipes, releasing lead, which is now in the bodies of so many of the children in that predominantly black community. That's one example. And then, of course, what we're seeing, I think there's a connection between what we're seeing on the Standing Rock Sioux Reservation and the potential pollution of their water. In order to run the fossil fuel, we should stop using fossil fuel anyway. It's like, it makes no sense. But I do think that environmental justice is ground zero of social justice movements.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Good evening, Ms. Angela Davis. It's an honor to meet you. My name is Brian Miranda. I was a part of the famous DREAM team that helped pass the first student bill in New Jersey, the in-state tuition equity for Dreamers. My family's undocumented, so I was an activist from my community. And as you know, the past year with Trump and the past 2 mass immigration raids, like, I feel there's like a giant fear, even for like the famous activists that I've worked with right now, to like really step up and step out to like not only continue our work, but like fight even harder. So like, I just really want to know, like, where do you find the courage when it just feels like we're losing on all angles? Because there's even a point where like one black kid gets shot and a whole city will go into riots. But like last year I read that there was an entire mass grave of undocumented Latinos in Texas, and they were fresh bodies, and it was like over 1,000 of them, and not one riot, not one nothing. So like, we feel real invisible right now. So I just want to know, like, where did you find that courage throughout all those years to like really step up? Because like, I could tell you right now, all of the activists that I'm affiliated with from here to Cali, like, we're shaking up right now. We are.
I'll speak to it, but I think Lennox has a
If
word
I-
of spirit.
If I understand the question, you're asking how can you and your colleagues and comrades find the courage to continue the struggle in the face of what you see to be setbacks, obstacles, and so on. Those of us who have dedicated our lives to the struggle, we many times get up in the morning and apply ourselves to whatever the tasks are at hand, in spite of setbacks. You cannot be deterred based upon momentary setbacks. You have to be not a sprinter, but a marathoner. You have to realize that the race is not for those who are running the 100-yard dash. And you have to pace yourself. I speak in those terms because I've been a jogger and a runner for a number of years. And I know that sometimes you think you're not going to be able to make the distance, but you have to endure and you have to pace yourself. So in the struggle, we recognize goals that we have to set. And you organize with your friends and comrades in order to achieve those particular goals. Many times there are setbacks. I know that as a lawyer, I have not won all of my cases. And there are cases that I have lost that I was shocked. But I learned from those. Not deterred from taking on additional cases, but learning from those experiences. And so I say to young people who are wondering, should they continue in the struggle, that you have only two choices. You either surrender or fight.
And you know, let me just add that here in this country, we have to all learn each other's stories. We have to be willing. I mean, many people think of the Ferguson protests as black protests, right? The protests against Michael Brown's death. But it was a multiracial protest. There were Latinos, there were Palestinian Americans involved in that protest. And I think that we have to figure out how to communicate to people that the struggle in defense of the rights of undocumented people in this country is a struggle that all of us have to embrace. And I'll just say that I know, I was talking about my case earlier. My trial took place in San Jose, California. And at that time, there were about 10 black people in San Jose. I mean, there may have been a few more. But there was no black community in San Jose. And so the organizing took place in the Chicano community. And the local base of support was the Chicano community there. And I think we have to learn how to do that kind of work because it's all interconnected. This is the meaning of the whole feminist notion of intersectionality too, right? You can't really be victorious in one arena without recognizing the more complicated, interconnected, interdependent context in which it happens.
Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. I have a question that either of you might take, Professor Davis or Professor Hines. I carry around, it's about political symbols. So I carry around in my wallet on the $1 bill the face of a slaveholder. Same thing on the $5 bill. In this room, often, not tonight oddly, there's a flag there that has 13 stripes, each representing a colony wherein slavery was legal in 1776. The date behind you of the founding of Rutgers was a time when slavery was legal in New Jersey, and our trustees, including Henry Rutgers, what the R stands for, was a slaveholder. So, and if I may make a vast historical leap here, but we have sports teams, a football team, and serious people in sports. When I say serious, I mean mainstream people in sports, like Joe Nocera, are saying this is a plantation, this is indentureship. So my question is, the left is split on this. The left is split. Should we fight over these kinds of battles, which are mostly symbolic, fighting over national symbols such as George Washington and the flag? I'm not talking about the Confederate flag, I'm talking about the first flag of slavery. Should we fight over these things, or should we spend our time fighting over materialist things, as you say, abolishing prisons, abolishing the death penalty, or do we have to fight over these together? I mean, can we win one without winning the other? I'd just like to see how you relate these materialist and symbolic struggles. Thank you.
You know, I think that you have to decide what are your main objectives as an organizer. What do you want to accomplish? There are educational objectives, that is, For example, if your objective is to educate the general public and perhaps the student body concerning the historic racism of Rutgers University or the symbolisms involving Rutgers and its historic and racist past, if that is an objective, that you're trying to expose this, I think this is worthwhile. And I don't think it is an either or, because there is virtue from an educational standpoint in correcting the past and educating individuals about the past and looking for some remedies that you will want to obtain from the university given its past history. Now, that has been happening in a number of institutions of higher learning in terms of individuals exposing the history and racism undergirding those institutions, and in fact perhaps requesting some kind of reparations, etc. I think that's important. But you have to decide in terms of what are the pressing issues within society that you want to address. Time is limited. You cannot address all issues. And you may use an issue dealing with the historic past in order to organize a faculty, in order to organize a student body, starting with this issue and then moving them to broader issues. But as an organizer, you have to think about where ultimately you want to address yourself and whatever the movement you're trying to organize.
You know, I would just say that I'm really, I think it's a complicated question that of what we do with this historical information that becomes available to us. You know, do we simply get rid of all of the sculptures and the flags and or do we try to figure out how to retain it in our historical memory? You know, we are inhabited by our histories, whether we understand them or not. Someone like Donald Trump, I mean, there is so much history to this idea of making America great again, right? Again. And so I think I would be for strategy. I totally agree with Lennox that, you know, it's not either or. We can't engage in the material struggles without recognizing the ways in which we have been transformed by the ideological, the symbolic, the historical. But we have to figure out a way to make that historical memory productive. We don't want to just get rid of it, because that's what's happened with slavery for all of these people. You know, we've just gotten to the point where we can even talk about slavery. And how long has it, how many years has it taken before, you know, slavery can be discussed in venues other than like a new movie? And it's interesting the way, since Roots, that's the only time we ever really had national discussions about slavery, is when a film came out. So that means that it seems to me if ever we are going to imagine being able to purge our worlds of racism, we have to figure out how to engage with this history and these symbols and figure out the ways in which they constrict us from acting in radical ways today.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
This is kind of tall. Okay. Good evening. Thank you so much for your words. I've appreciated you all so much. My question is in relation to the story that Professor Davis was telling about her acquittal and the night that you all celebrated. And you mentioned something about the energy and how the next day you all tried to figure out a way to take that energy and instill it in what you're doing. Part of what I do is I go into classrooms in New York City and I talk about the Black Lives Matter movement, and I talk about you know, like what's happening in social media and how youth voices and youth choice can be used in those spaces in a way in which, you know, they become activists. And one of my main concerns has been that same kind of energy. Like, how do you take that energy and instill it into the Black Lives Matter movement in a way in which it can, like, speak to the young people and in a way that they feel like they have a part of it. And so I guess my question is how, well, one, how did you take that energy that you felt that night at that party and instill it in what you did afterwards? And how do you think, as young activists and you know, teaching or talking with younger activists, how we can instill that same kind of energy into them?
I was talking about the energy that was generated by the global struggle to free me, which was, and also the energy that went into the partying. But the way you ask your question made me recognize how important popular culture is and how important music is in developing and helping to generate that consciousness. And if you look now, there are so many artists trying to figure out how they can make their music relevant to what's going on today. You know, after we saw Kendrick Lamar and you know, his work, and I mean, even regardless of what you might think about Beyonce, you know, Lemonade is really an amazing offering. And so I think we often underestimate the role that artists played. Lennox was evoking Aretha Franklin, and without Aretha, there would have been no movement in the late 60s. You know, Aretha Franklin, Nina Simone was the soundtrack of, you know, of the movement. So yeah, I think we have to learn how to understand that and learn how to give expression to it and create collective energy. And you do it by, you know, by engaging in the kind of struggle that is also going to produce joy and pleasure. You can have fun being involved in the movement. It's not just, people think of it as sacrifice. And oftentimes people thank me for sacrificing my life. And I said, you know, I've enjoyed all of this. I haven't experienced it as sacrifice. There was nothing else that I would have really wanted to do. So you have to make the movement be a space of joy and pleasure and struggle at the same time.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for gracing us with your presence tonight. I'm a student from Sweden visiting here, and I've seen a lot that the right-wing movement, the fascist movement, the Nazi movements in Europe, in Asia, in the US, and in all parts of the world have grown stronger and have united in a way that I see lacking in our own progressive movements. are we doing something wrong? And what can we learn from what they have accomplished? Or should we even learn something from them?
Well, okay, well, okay. See, I would actually look at it somewhat differently. I would say that we have failed, as people who have a radical and progressive vision, we have failed to popularize a narrative that would allow people who otherwise are attracted to racist and fascist movements to understand that, that the forces which have led to their sense of economic injustice are the same forces that are responsible for racism. I mean, if one looks at all of these people who seem drawn to Trump, I look at these rallies and the way these mostly white people respond to Trump, and it makes me realize that we haven't done our job, because they're suffering as a result of the consequences of global capitalism. They're suffering as a result of the increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of a few people on this planet, and they have been made to think that a man like Donald Trump, who hasn't even paid taxes, who is trying to profit from that system that allows for the concentration of wealth in that way, that he's their savior. When fascism emerged in Germany, it was at the same time that there were all of these, that there was this promise of socialism. And this is why they call the party National Socialists, precisely because of the extent to which people were beginning to imagine a transformed society, a non-capitalist society. It all comes down to organizing, I think, and changing the ways in which people imagine themselves in relation to each other. It's hard, there's no formula. It's hard work that we haven't done and that we have to do in the future.
Thank you.
Hi, Professor Davis. I thanked you once. I'm thank you again because I'm a real big fan of your work. My name is Storm. I'm from Ferguson activist, and also Mizzou, but that has nothing to do with what I'm about to say. So my first question is for you, Professor Davis, and my second question, either one of you can answer. So I do consider myself a prison abolitionist, but I'm conflicted in the fight because I think of violent offenders, and I know you mentioned that we can move to a society where there isn't violence to put people into prison. But in the meantime, what is your advice to, one, move to that society, and two, to deal with murderers, rapists, people harming vulnerable populations, because that's just something that's on my mind. And my second question is, and this is the one either one of you can answer. So there is a black woman running for president, Monica Moorhead, under the Workers' World Party. And I was wondering, how do we strengthen the value of third-party candidates and third parties that don't even get invited to debates?
Well, how much longer are we going to go?
I think for about 5 or 10 more minutes at the
5 or
latest.
10
So,
more minutes, okay. When we say that we want to abolish prisons, we don't mean that violence should exist in our communities. what we mean is that we need to develop other ways, more effective ways of addressing the harm that happens. I mean, the problem is the vast majority of the almost 2.5 million people in jails and prisons in this country are not violent.
Yeah.
And even those who are classified as violent offenders, oftentimes that's at the discretion of the law enforcement officer who can decide to charge with burglary or robbery or shoplifting or whatever. The exact same act can be both nonviolent and it can be violent. So we have to be cautious about the ways in which we use that term. Then there's the question of people who inflict terrible harm on others. And if I take the example of gender violence, which is the most pandemic form of violence in the world, and ask if we simply decide that we're going to address gender violence by incarcerating the perpetrators of gender violence. We've been doing this actually for the last couple of decades, maybe 2 decades. It's been about 40 years since we became aware of the need to address this issue. But the thing is that even though a significant number of people have been arrested on charges that used to not even be considered a crime, the incidence of gender violence has not changed at all. So it means that the more you put people in prison, the more you're going to see exactly the same kind of violence, because the imprisonment often further complicates the violence and reproduces the violence. So the question is, how can you develop ways that will really get rid of the violence? You know, what can we do? This idea that the only way we can treat people who commit acts that are harmful is by putting them in prison has so stifled our ability to think about how we might go about getting rid of the behavior as opposed to simply punishing the behavior. And this is going to take a long time. It's not going to happen tomorrow. You know, some people imagine it as something that will only happen over generations. So you have to strategize for 5 generations. So you have to think ahead long after you yourself will no longer be on this earth in order to try to figure out what we can do to rid the world of gender violence. So, you know, and not every, the law treats every act of murder as categorizable or violence, fatal violence as categorizable in terms of first degree, second degree, third degree murder. So you have these categories, but those categories don't tell you why the person did it and what we need to change. So I want to see a strategy, a system that will allow us to be much more nuanced, that will allow us to begin to recognize what it is we can do to actually rid ourselves of these horrible instances of harm against human and other beings.
Professor Davis and Professor Hines has been extremely generous with their time, and I don't want to deny those online, the 7 online. So perhaps what we do, just very quickly, ask the theme you want to ask, and then we can just round off with a closing statement from both of you. Okay, so let's start. So just very quickly, the question, we'll just go through the 7 that's online, and then we'll give Professor Hines and Professor Davis the final word. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Saskia. Lately, we've been talking about what it means to be black in my Pan-Africanism class, and I'm half black and half white, so this gives me a very unique perspective. So I feel compelled to ask, through your experience of examining race and how race determines how somebody is seen in this world and who they actually are in this world, do you think that there's something innately different between black people and white people?
Okay.
It's a tough question.
Okay. Yes,
Hi, so I've just begun a PhD program here at Rutgers, and I'm someone who considers themselves radical or has a radical vision, and I'm wondering, or I want to ask, how do you either negotiate or navigate a sense of a radical self and an academic or professional self?
okay, thank you. Yes, the next question from that end.
Hi. As a woman who was only a little over a year ago completing a 13-year prison sentence, I know what it is to be in an oppressed situation, and especially in an institution. So my question is, in envisioning or reimagining prisons, do we also rethink what is criminal?
Yes, sir.
Good evening. Thank you both for joining us this evening. I just have a question regarding the continuities between the Black Panther movement and also the Black Lives Matter movement. I know recent hashtags have hit social media, hashtag Say Her Name. How, as a movement that has been founded by not only women of color, but queer women of color, how can we bring these women to the forefront of the Black Lives Matter? I don't find that the hashtag Say Her Name is enough. In many instances, you don't hear of Sandra Bland, unfortunately, and other women of color who have lost their lives due to racist police violence. And so my question is, how can we bring them closer to the forefront of this movement?
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Professor Davis and Professor Hines, thank you so much for speaking today. So if I recall correctly, Professor Davis said something to the effect that once you get old, you start to forget what it felt like to be young, and I kind of want to put you back in a position where you possibly have to feel that way. I'm of the belief that movements don't simply dissipate and then new movements are born anew. I think there's always a way in which you excavate old movements back into the new ones, and so particularly for Professor Davis, I'm wondering what Professor Marcusa's effect on you was throughout your years and how it became formative to you, and what piece of Marcusa you still keep with you today.
Yes.
Hi, Professor Davis. I've actually wanted to ask this question for a while, even if I won't get an answer, but I'm a part of the queer movement and have been for a very long time, doing a lot of grassroots organizing with my home and then continuing through Rutgers. And during the fight for marriage equality and after, there was kind of a shift in the movement away from radical action and away from marriage as an attempt to allow partners to visit each other when receiving medical care, which was very direly needed when the movement started. It has now kind of become this very assimilationist movement of if we pretend to be straight or make ourselves appealing to those around us, we'll be safe, when in reality this doesn't protect anyone. How can we go about re-radicalizing the movement to the point where it can be a protective space and not just a new way of hiding?
Hi, good evening. My question is about corporate interests in law and how they're intertwined, as you see within national borders with lobbyist groups, buying politicians for millions of dollars, and international laws being influenced by organizations like the IMF. Is it still worth pursuing a law degree nowadays? How influential would you be?
Well, I guess on that note, we can go to Professor Hines and then.
Should I do the questions and then let you in, or do you want to begin?
Well, is it worth pursuing a law degree today? It depends upon what you want to do as a lawyer. That is the fundamental question you have to ask. In whose interests will you serve? That is the fundamental question. The issue isn't a question of whether you pursue corporate law or whether you focus on criminal law, or whether you focus on immigration law, or whether you are concerned with patent law, the fundamental question is, in whose interest would you serve? And once you make that decision, then whatever the area of the law that you are working in, you will then begin to resolve the issues, identify the issues, resolve the remedies in the interests of the constituency that you serve. For me, I have never viewed myself as representing a corporate interest. I have always pitted my resources, skills, insights on the side of those who were the have-nots in the society. And I've always been swimming upstream. Most individuals who I have taught, and many of my colleagues I've seen in law school, they have started off with a vision of representing the have-nots. But American society is like an oyster, which takes in the most abrasive elements and rocks, secretes enzymes, and turns out what? Pearls. For the rocks, they do not realize that they have become pearls. And I have always encouraged young people. I surround myself with young people. Why? Because I want them to constantly challenge me, to make sure that I do not, if I become a pearl, that they tell me, Hines, you are becoming a pearl. Young people have the enthusiasm that I draw energy from in terms of staying in power. People say to me, after all of these years, don't you get tired of swimming upstream? The answer is no, because I draw inspiration from young people around me. And I've never changed the answer to the basic question, in whose interest do I serve? And so I say to young people, it matters not what area of the law you want to focus on. The question really is, what do you want to do with those skills, and in whose interest will you serve?
Well, Professor Davis,
Okay, let's see.
Peter Makuza's influence on your life and his relevance.
No, I have,
so
there's a question of blackness, radical and academic self, rethinking criminality,
Yes.
queer dimension of Black Lives Matter, Herbert Marcuse, and how the queer movement can be re-radicalized.
we'll have to invite you for another lecture, or a series of lectures.
And I'll see if I can answer each one with 3 words. First of all, for me, blackness is about, it's a political identity, more than anything else. And at the core of that identity is an acknowledgement of the historical definition of blackness in relation to the struggle for freedom. So the Black radical tradition is a tradition with which anyone can identify. Now, I'm not saying that there is no specificity about Black culture and Black history, certainly there is. But I like to try to define it as broadly as possible so that it does not become yet another way to exclude people. Radical, I think academics should be radical. I mean, what is knowledge? Knowledge knowledge should always be radical. What does radical mean? And I'll answer the question about Marcuse here, because one of the things that Marcuse used to say over and over again is that to be radical is to refuse to remain at the surface of things and try to understand things in terms of their roots. The meaning of radical is root. The meaning of radical is root. And we have to rethink crime. Crime is a construction of the law. What is criminal is what is against the law, right? And so, we have to try to understand the extent to which we've been become ideologically habituated to the idea that crime is something that exists, that is permanent, that is not socially constructed. And then the question of the Black Lives Matter. What's so exciting about Black Lives Matter is that it is led by women, by queer women. And when we think about the fact that virtually all movements are what they are because of the role of women. Women have always been, and there have been some good men too, who've done good organizing, but in general, women are the ones who do the work. And so Black Lives Matter is in the tradition of someone like Ella Baker, who was one of the major figures of what we know as the civil rights movement. But because she did not fit into, nor did she try to remake herself in the image of the kind of charismatic, masculinist frame, which is the way we don't recognize leadership unless it's male leadership, unless it's male charismatic leadership. We don't recognize collective leadership, and this is what Patrice and Alicia and Opal are trying to do, to create new models of leadership that completely contravene, what it is we have grown so accustomed to over the years. And the last question about the extent to which queer movements have been moving in an assimilationist. I don't think queer movements in general, but certainly the mainstream movements. I think that the Supreme Court decision on marriage equality was really important because it's a civil right, and everybody should have the right to marry. But that doesn't mean that marriage is a good thing for anybody. And so, how do we retain that critical perspective? Marriage historically has been a system of distributing property. I'm not saying relationships aren't a good thing. I'm not saying the emotional ties that people feel, but the institution of marriage is a capitalist institution. So initially, the gay movement, the approach of the movement was, let's abolish the institution of marriage. That was the feminist approach. That is what we could have done in order to create equality, as opposed to assuming that the only road to equality is an assimilationist role. And so I would say that in the LGBTQ movement, some of the most important work is being done by people who are organizing against violence, by people who are recognizing the extent to which, especially anti-trans violence, violence that manifests a kind of transphobia that gets expressed in all aspects of the gender ideologies that we are subjected to. So I think people like Dean Spade, have you read Dean Spade's work? Is absolutely amazing. There's a great book by a former student of mine, an anthology about trans embodiment and the prison industrial complex. It's called Captive Bodies. And so you see that the work that is being done by the queer movement at that level of challenging violence acknowledges the importance of contesting the entire prison industrial complex. C.C. McDonald, for example, there's a film coming out very soon about C.C. McDonald, who is the trans woman who was terribly brutalized in Minnesota and ended up spending time behind bars. And she has emerged as a leader who's able to point out the intersectionality of abolitionists' work with respect to the prison industrial complex in relation to abolishing the policing of gender. There's a connection between imprisonment and the ways in which the institution itself serves to police gender. Because there's male prisons and there are female prisons, right? And so what happens if you don't fit into those categories? And then that creates a great deal of the violence, because the assumption is that people who are gender non-conforming are going to be the targets of violence within the prison, and the guards rely on that violence in order to make the entire system more governable. So you see, what might appear to be a minor issue turns out to be a huge, huge question that has relevance to all of us who want to fight for a better world and for radical visions of justice.
Thank you, Professors Davis and Professor Hines. And thank you all for coming. There are some refreshments outside, so please participate. Thank you again.